June 3, 1997, 6:12 p.m., Tacoma, Washington. Rain ticking like a metronome against the windows of the Rainier Adult Learning Annex. 9 adults signed the roll for an evening GD field visit. Then the sign-in pen went cold. No skid marks. No calls. No bodies. The director, Gordon Hale, told staff the trip was canceled due to weather, yet witnesses remember the group lining up, backpacks slung, eyes fixed on a future that should have been ordinary. What happened to Hannah Carver, 19, stubborn, quick with a laugh, the one who promised her mother she'd be home by 10? 15 years later, contractors will tear into this forgotten annex and force a second look at everything we thought we knew. The records will not match the stories. The stories will not match the walls. A question will outlive the rain. Something waited here. Something never left. The day began like any other in the building. Adults joked was the night school with a pulse. Coffee steam curled in the break room. A fluorescent bulb hummed. Hannah arrived early, her binder clipped and scuffed, the edges taped with a strip of purple she said was lucky. She called her mother, Linda, from the pay phone in the lobby at 5:02 p.m. The call lasted 83 seconds. Linda remembers the exact number because she watched the minute hand crawl while quarters dropped and clinked on the metal tray. "I'll be home by 10:30 if the bus runs late," Hannah said. "Don't wait up." Linda waited anyway. The field visit was supposed to be a short ride to a workforce center near the port of Tacoma. Then the weather changed, wind pushing gray in from Commencement Bay, rain smearing the neon reflections along South 38th. Hale stood in the doorway of room 204, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, saying the visit was off, that they'd pivot to a resume workshop instead. He smiled the way administrators smile when they want compliance without questions. But minutes later, according to 2 students in another class, the 9 from Hannah's section filed out anyway, following their instructor, J. Rowan, down the hall and toward the stairwell that led to the annex's side lot. No bus idled there. No driver signed in. The stairwell camera had been under maintenance for a week. At 7:41 p.m., Deputy Noel Hart logged a welfare check call from Linda. She'd driven the corridor twice, the wipers slapping a hard rhythm, the dashboard clock reddening her worry. The annex custodian, a man named Ortiz, told Hart he'd seen nobody unusual, then requested personal leave the following Monday and never came back. Building keycard reports later showed a flurry of door cycles after 8 p.m., but the time stamps were rounded in 30-minute blocks. It made the timeline slippery, like oil on wet asphalt. Officially, the case veered toward a highway accident theory. Unofficially, it drifted into a folder that gathered dust and the occasional note from Linda. A map highlighted in yellow, a list of storm drains she'd walked at night, the names of creeks where she'd knelt and prayed. It's easy to tell the grieving to wait. It's hard to ask them to stop looking. Linda didn't stop. She learned the annex's rhythms, which lights buzzed, which doors stuck in damp weather, where the basement air turned colder even in June. She found a plastic tag near the stairwell, the kind that snaps onto a key ring. The number 47 was pressed into it, the edges worn smooth. When she took it to Hale and asked if the annex had numbered keys, he laughed and told her to get some rest. That night, she couldn't. She stood in Hannah's room, touching the binder with the purple tape, and tried to reconcile 2 truths that refused to overlap. 9 adults can't disappear from a building in the middle of a city, and yet 9 did. There was no memorial. There was no wreckage. The rain, a witness without words, kept time. Some nights, Linda drove to the port after her shift, parking where cranes moved like patient giants and ships exhaled low horns into fog. She watched the water take the light and return nothing. On the anniversary in 2002, she mailed a letter to the county council demanding a full structural survey of the annex. She never received a reply. In 2006, when Hart earned his sergeant bars, he phoned her to say he'd reopen anything new she found. She thumbed the tag stamped 47 and asked what counted as new. Something that contradicts the first story, he said. Or something that shouldn't exist. Here's what shouldn't exist. A sign-out sheet with 2 different inks for the same signature line. A field visit approval form with a date stamp set to the wrong week. A lock on a basement door that no one admits to having a key for. Here's what does exist. A mother who refuses to turn the page because the page is glued to the rest of her life. Her search map grew pores from pushpins and thread. She taped the annex blueprint to her kitchen wall and traced the hallways in pencil until the paper thinned. She called former students and staff, leaving messages that were careful not to accuse and precise with time. 6:12 p.m., she'd say, the moment the roll call went cold. If you remember anything, call me. Tacoma moved on. The annex did not. It kept its lights, its hum, its windows that watched the weather. And somewhere between those windows and the rooms beneath them, a story tightened into a knot, one that would hold for 15 years, until new hands, unburdened by the first investigation, pried it loose by accident. The mystery was never out on the road. It had stayed closer, breathing through the walls, waiting for the right blow to make it speak. What happened to Hannah? The building knows. And the building is patient. At 9:18 a.m. on March 5, 2012, a contractor swung a sledge into the cinder block along the basement corridor of the Rainier Adult Learning Annex. The wall shuddered, coughed dust, then cracked at the mortar seam where paint never quite matched. One more blow split it open. Cold air spilled out, stale and mineral, the kind of air that lives behind secrets. The crew shut off their radios without being told. Inside the gap, a room waited, intact in a way that didn't make sense. 9 desks in neat rows, a smudge of chalk on the board that read, in a hand too steady for panic, June 3, 1997. A paper cup sat on the teacher's desk with a coffee ring dried into a pale halo. Coats hung from hooks, all adult sizes, labels printed with last names. There were scuffs on the linoleum that ended where the wall had been. The room shouldn't have existed. But it did. Sheriff Noel Hart arrived with a camera and a careful face. He'd been the deputy who took Linda Carver's first late-night call, the one who promised to look again if something new surfaced. Now, new had its own gravity. He watched Linda step through the breach in a white paper suit, gloved hands shaking as she reached for a gray hoodie with H. Carver heat pressed over the pocket. It was heavier than it looked, damp with the basement's long breath. Linda pressed it to her sternum as if it might restart a heart. Across the room, a spiral notebook lay open to a page of vocabulary words. Pivot, credential, verify. There was a check mark beside verify. On the desk was an envelope warped by moisture but sealed in the old-fashioned way. Flap licked and pressed. The name J. Rowan marked the corner in block letters. Hart slid it with a scalpel while the contractor crew waited at the doorway like men who'd stumbled into a church. The note inside was brief, written with the deliberate strokes of a teacher who still expects to be graded. If someone finds this, know we did not leave this building. Director Hale canceled the visit. Then he said we would transfer after dark. Doors locked from the outside. Custodian Ortiz took instructions from someone I could not see. If we are moved, it will be through the lower corridor. Tell them I tried. J. Rowan. The handwriting thinned at the end, as if the writer had been listening for footsteps. Hart called the county attorney. The county attorney called the bureau. Special Agent Elena Park drove down from Seattle by noon, gray suit like a vertical line through the dust. She worked the room as if it were a witness. Angles of light, dust drifts, the way the chalk line on the board wavered where a right-handed person would lift at the end of a stroke. She pointed at a hairline seam behind the wall clock, then at a faint rectangle where paint had sealed the outline of something removed. There was a camera here, she said quietly. No lens burn, which means it wasn't running long. Someone wanted a record, then didn't. They tagged and bagged in silence, re-scanned the annex blueprints, then rolled out a ground-penetrating antenna as if they might read the building's bones. Linda stood at the doorway until Park stepped beside her and spoke the sentence victims' families learned to translate. We're reopening everything. It means the deadbolt on the past is cut, but the door still sticks. It means you will hear the same questions again, this time with sharper edges. It also means that the first story, the safe story, has failed. In a drawer beneath the desk, they found another envelope, smaller, brittle at the folds. Inside lay a plastic key tag stamped 47 and the word Cascade faintly inked on one edge, as if the pen had given up mid-stroke. Hart turned it in his palm and looked at Park. She didn't ask what it belonged to, She asked who would have access. Hale, obviously. Rowan, likely. Ortiz, almost certainly. The room contracted a little at the name Ortiz. He had resigned a week after the disappearances. His HR file said relocation, family reasons. His forwarding address led to a mailbox store. The clerk there remembered no one. When they finally let Linda sit at the teacher's desk, she didn't read the letter again. She stared at the coffee ring until the white ring became a clock, and the clock became that night, and that night became the gap in her life. Park eased into the chair beside her and, in the practiced kindness of someone who hunts facts for a living, asked what Linda wanted to do now. Linda lifted the key tag in one hand and the hoodie in the other. "I want to see where this goes," she said. Park nodded. "Then stay with this. Small things unlock bigger things. We will move carefully and we will move forward. There's a reason we follow investigations step by step. You can't rush a story built on locked doors and missing verbs. If you want to understand it, you walk the hallways in order. You keep track of the objects that repeat. A number, a word, a seam that returns in different rooms. What we're doing here is patience. If you're listening closely, thread by thread, each detail will click into the one ahead of it, and the picture will sharpen not because we force it but because the pieces belong." Outside, Tacoma shook off a brief sun shower and went back to work. Inside, a team in paper suits mapped a room that had been waiting to be believed. Hart stood alone at the chalkboard and made himself read the date out loud. Park signed the chain of custody form and said she wanted copies of Hale's maintenance orders, Ortiz's timesheets, and every camera service ticket for 6 months on either side of June 1997. Linda folded the hoodie and set it down as if putting a child to bed, then pocketed the plastic tag with the number that had been haunting her for years. She didn't ask permission. She'd been asking permission for 15. They sealed the room in sterile plastic and turned off the lights. The hum of the annex returned, steady, indifferent. Linda paused in the hallway, fingers pressed to the bagged letter, and felt a flicker she hadn't allowed herself in a decade and a half. Not certainty. Not yet. Just the first clean inhale after too long underwater. She looked back once, memorizing the doorway, the precise flake of paint, the smudge where a shoulder had leaned long ago. The wall would close again soon, but the story had already opened. Somewhere in this city, someone had kept a key. Someone still does. Linda called at 12:11 a.m., the hour when the city thins out and voices travel farther than they should. Marilyn Hale answered on the third ring, breath catching on Linda's name as if she'd been expecting it for 15 years. She didn't ask how Linda found her number. She asked what finally broke the wall. Linda told her, briefly, clinically, the room, the letter signed by J. Rowan, the plastic tag stamped 47 and a faint word that looked like Cascade. Silence held, then a laugh too tired to be cruel. "He told me the building would keep his secrets better than people ever could," Marilyn said, and the word he drew a shadow across the kitchen tiles under Linda's feet. She turned off the light, let the dark give her cover, and asked the question she'd carried like a hot coin since 1997. Did Gordon make them leave that night? Marilyn didn't say yes. She didn't have to. Words spilled in a low monotone, the kind people use to talk past shame. Back then, the annex had become Gordon's kingdom, budgets, contractors, schedules, all the small levers that move bigger ones. He talked about pathways and placements, about giving certain students a chance somewhere else if they were disruptive, or if home would not let them become who the program needed. He said it like a service. He said paperwork would follow. After the disappearances, he insisted on grief counselors and a memorial idea that never materialized. He never cried where anyone could see him. He did play poker on Thursdays with a captain who later retired on a disability pension no one could explain. And once, only once, Marilyn came home early and found Gordon in his study with a man who kept his jacket on the whole time and asked no questions back. "I called him the cleaner in my head," Marilyn said. "I read that in a novel. The man died in an accident in 2004. A polite obituary. No details." Linda pressed her fingers to the countertop until they tingled and asked why Marilyn hadn't spoken then. The answer was simple and ugly. She tried. The captain returned her call, asked if she was okay, and suggested a break from anxious news would help. A week later, her car was keyed in their driveway. The next day, Gordon left a pamphlet on trauma on her nightstand with a yellow note, "For the worry." She filed for divorce the next spring and hired Brenner and Cole LLP because their office was on the bus line and she could sit in the back row and feel anonymous. "They handled my alimony," she said. "He wanted it quiet. He paid ahead. When the monthly envelope stopped, 3 years ago, I slept through the night." Brenner and Cole's lobby smelled like copier ozone and lemon. Morning light made a grid across the carpet. Martin Cole had a face that belonged to receipts and filing deadlines, careful and gray at the temples. He did the professional dance first, condolences, caution, chain of custody disclaimers, until Linda placed the plastic tag on the edge of his desk and said the room was real, the letter was real, and the only fiction left was the hope that time erases facts. He sat down hard. "Marilyn told me someone would come one day," he said. "She asked me to hold something in case that day belonged to you." From the bottom drawer, he brought out a sealed manila envelope with her name written in a neat block print that didn't match Gordon's wide accountant hand. The seal cracked with a sigh. Inside lay a single sheet typed on an old machine and a brass key whose smoothness suggested 1,000 thumb swipes. The paper had no letterhead, only lines like orders. Storage. US 12. Cascade Self-Storage. Unit 47. Bring one witness you trust. Do not call the director. He has friends with keys. Cole confessed that he'd opened nothing. He just kept it because Marilyn asked and because, long ago, a client's panic had taught him that sometimes the safest way to help is to hold still until asked. He asked if he should call the police. Linda said the police were already awake. She texted Sheriff Noel Hart a photo of the page and the key, then called Special Agent Elena Park from the parking garage where the concrete dripped onto the hood of her car like a slow metronome. Park listened without interrupting, then said she wanted one more thing: Hale's maintenance orders around June 1997, copied in full, and any vendor names tied to basement alterations. "Patterns hide in invoices," Park said. "People confess with their supply chains." On the way to the elevator, Linda felt a pressure in the air the way you feel weather turn before the sky proves it. She looked up and saw a man watching from the mezzanine railing in a dark windbreaker that didn't fit the season. His gaze slid away cleanly when hers met it. In the garage mirror, a sedan idled 2 rows back, engine ticking. She drove 3 laps on the lower levels, exited, then re-entered on the opposite side to see if the sedan followed. It did, lazily, like a tail that wants to be seen enough to change behavior. She parked by a pillar and called Hart again. "You're not paranoid if the story's real," he said. "Stay where there are cameras. We'll meet at the storage facility in daylight, and you'll walk in behind me." Linda slid the brass key onto the ring with her house and car keys. It felt too normal there, as if it belonged all along, as if the last 15 years had only been a prelude to this motion. Metal to metal, a click, a choice. She placed the envelope back in her bag and sat with both hands on the wheel until her breath found its count. Then she drove toward US 12 with the sedan 2 cars behind, and a fact she could no longer ignore tightening like thread through everything. Gordon Hale had built a story that fit on paper, and someone had spent years making sure it stayed there. The lock would tell the truth. If it opened, Cascade Self-Storage sat low against the gray line of US 12, the kind of place you only notice when you need a place to hide something. Sheriff Noel Hart parked nose out by the office. Special Agent Elena Park arrived 2 minutes later, hair tied back, a clipboard tucked under her arm like a warrant that hadn't yet learned its own power. Linda waited in her car until the brass key warmed in her palm. When she stepped out, the air smelled like wet plywood and old rubber, clean enough to lie without being caught. Hart walked point, Park scanned the perimeter. Linda kept count of her breaths as they passed rows of corrugated doors, numbers ticking upward until 47 looked back at them like an answer that might not want to be said out loud. The lock took the key on the first try. Metal yielded with a sound too soft for what it meant. The door rolled up and stayed where Hart stopped it, shoulder braced, as if the unit might change its mind. Inside, cardboard boxes lined both side walls in measured stacks, lids facing out, each label printed in the same disciplined hand. K. Duarte 1996, Nguyen 1998, H. Carver 1997. 22 names. 22 years and programs. Each box the size of a torso, not heavy but dense in the way memory is dense, weight out of proportion to matter. Park photographed labels, corners, dust halos, the pattern of scuffs on the concrete. Hart gloved up and pulled H. Carver to the floor, kneeling with care that felt like reverence. Linda didn't ask permission. She knelt opposite and lifted the lid. On top lay a cropped class photo she'd never seen, edges flagged where fingers had stood too long. Across several faces, someone had drawn faint slashes of dry blue ink, not excess, just cancellations. Beneath it sat a microcassette in a cracked clear case marked in block letters, June 3, 1997/intake, final. There were personal fragments arranged like a story, a folded schedule printed on annex letterhead, a half-used bus pass with the route line blacked out, the corner of a GD study guide page torn clean at the spine. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue, was Hannah's keychain, a flat brass circle etched with a riverline she used to trace while thinking. Linda had forgotten the sound it made against the apartment door. Now the memory rang again, small and precise. Park set a handheld recorder on the concrete, then connected an old microcassette player she kept for days exactly like this. The tape spooled, hissed, clicked, then steadied. A man's voice came first, low, patient, theatercom. "We're going to talk about choices," he said. "Opportunities. What happens when a door opens and someone like me can help you walk through?" A woman's voice answered, Hannah's, careful and wary, each yes pulled thin as thread. The questions were wrong in the way polished questions are wrong, framed to sound benevolent, engineered to extract consent. If you didn't feel safe where you live, would you accept placement? If leaving meant you could finish what you started, would you sign? If the people who love you don't understand change, would you trust someone who does? Linda's hands shook. Park lightly touched her sleeve without looking away from the player. The tape clicked again, then the man said a name he had no right to say, Gordon, and stopped himself, clearing his throat, recovering, moving on like a practiced MC who knew how to edit in real time. Footsteps shifted outside the unit. They weren't deputies. They weren't customers. Hart stood in one motion, holster unsnapped, telling whoever was there to stay out until called. The silhouette in the light looked familiar before the face did. Gordon Hale stepped into the threshold and smiled at the boxes like a curator visiting an archive. He wore the same loosened tie he always wore near the end of a long day, as if time were a costume he could shrug on and off. "I wondered when you'd find this," he said, as if welcoming guests. "You've taken good care of my casework." Hart blocked his way. Park introduced herself by last name only. Hale's eyes slid to Linda, rested on the open box, and brightened with the recognition that only true arrogance permits. He didn't look at the recorder. He didn't need to. "You think those tapes tell a crime," he said softly. "They document a service. Adults who wanted out. Adults who needed structure. We provided options when your systems could not." He spoke like he was still at a lectern, borrowing institutional words to launder private decisions. He called the unit a repository. He called the program a pathway. He called himself necessary. Park didn't argue the theory. She asked facts. Who else had keys? Who signed approvals? Who sealed a room under a staircase and wrote the date on the chalkboard? Hale answered without answering. "The annex was a maze," he said. "Old buildings grow cavities. They keep what you ask them to keep." Hart leaned closer and mentioned the basement letter and the name Ortiz. Hale shrugged. "The custodian is dead," he said, and grieved nothing. Then he let the threat surface, not loud, not crude, but polished to plausible deniability. "Some of our placements are thriving," he said. "Good jobs. Good families. You pull at this thread, you unravel their lives. The law doesn't forbid mercy." The word mercy curled in the cold air like smoke. Park's face didn't change, but her questions narrowed. Vendor names. Invoices. Lease signatures. Hale slipped just once. "You could ask at Riverside Roasters," he said, too fast, too familiar. "They." He cut the sentence in half, realizing he'd given context he hadn't meant to give. Linda felt the world tilt a fraction, enough to notice the line between accident and admission. She folded Hannah's keychain into her fist and committed the phrase to muscle memory, Riverside Roasters. Hart told Hale to step back out of the unit. Hale obeyed in the slow, theatrical way of men who want the camera to keep rolling. He took one last look at H. Carver's box and smiled at Linda like he could still define the words on her face. "You'll have a decision to make," he said. "Truth has a blast radius. Decide how many people you want to burn." Then he left, escorted and unhurried, a man who believed he'd just forecast the weather. Park powered down the tape player and logged the box into evidence. Linda knelt and, for the first time in 15 years, let the math change. The goalposts had moved from finding what happened to proving where to go next. Outside, engines idled. A muted phone vibrated with a text Linda didn't recognize. She opened it and saw a photo shot from across a riverwalk. A woman balancing a to-go tray, head turned mid-laugh, a familiar slant to her shoulders, a ring of light on the water like brass under thumb. The caption was 4 words, no punctuation, Riverside Roasters, Boise, tonight. Linda reached Boise before dusk, following the river like a vein of light. Riverside Roasters sat at the bend where joggers slowed and office workers cupped their phones with both hands against the wind. She parked across from the front windows and watched the rhythm inside. Cups up, steam hissing, a barista laughing at something small. The woman in the photo moved through the bar like she'd learned the room by heart. Brown hair tied back, sleeves pushed, a silver band catching light when she reached for lids. Linda knew the posture before she knew the face. How the right shoulder carried more weight, how the left foot angled when listening. She had watched that stance grow up in doorways and mirrors. Names could be changed, muscle memory not so easily. She called Sheriff Noel Hart from the lot with the heater running low. He said he'd ping the Boise PD and loop in Agent Park. "Do not go in alone," he said, and the word alone traveled heavier than the others. Linda promised and then failed her promise, but not on impulse. She waited, counted the customers, timed the shift lead disappearing into the back with boxes. 10 minutes later, a man in a windbreaker drifted past her hood, eyes forward, too slow for a jogger, too deliberate for a passerby. He stopped by the window, adjusted his watch, then moved on, but his reflection lagged in the glass like a thought that wasn't done thinking. Linda watched him a second time in the opposite window, a trick angle that let her see his hand when he put it in his pocket, and the way his fingers flexed around something heavy. She stepped out with her coat zipped to the throat and the brass key warm against her palm in the pocket where she'd been carrying it since Cascade. The bell over the cafe door gave a polite, pointless chime. Coffee, milk, winter coats, the sound of ceramic meeting metal. The woman looked up. "Hey there," she said. "We're just closing out the register in a minute, but I can get you something to go." The voice didn't match memories. The cadence did. Linda asked for a black coffee and a second to speak privately. The barista's eyes narrowed the friendly amount businesses teach for safety. "I'm Sarah," she said, cautious, professional. The new name hit like cold air opening the lungs too fast. Linda set cash on the counter and said she had driven a long way to keep a promise. She did not say the old name. She did not say the year. She said, "You have a habit of turning your ring when you're unsure," and Sarah's hand stilled on cue. The windbreaker man entered behind her, the bell doing its small duty again. He took a two-top near the door and watched the sidewalk as if it were a mirror. Linda angled her body to block his view of her mouth and lowered her voice until it felt like a wire between them. "I believe someone who hurt people I love is nearby. If I ask you to step into the back right now, will your manager vouch that you left early?" Sarah's smile went brittle. "Ma'am, that's not how we do closings." The man stood, then sat, then stood again, a little choreography for anyone keeping score. Linda flashed a name on a folded note, Elena Park, and told Sarah to call it, to say only that she was with a woman who asked for help. Sarah read the name, and something behind her eyes shifted from customer service to private triage. She lifted the shop phone, dialed, and asked for Elena in a voice that shook only once. The man at the door checked his watch again and pivoted toward the hall that led behind the counter. Linda moved first. "Sir, restroom is for customers," she said, bright and wrong, and he smiled with no teeth. "Then pour me something," he said, not looking at her. Sarah's manager emerged from the back carrying a ledger, then stiffened at the posture, the tone, the tension he couldn't yet name. "We're closed," he said. The man's hand went deeper into his jacket and came out empty, palm up. A peace sign turned into a gesture that said move. Linda reached behind the counter and found the aluminum bat every cafe keeps for worst-case scenarios. She didn't raise it. She rested the barrel against the floor and let the message carry. "We are not prey." The man's expression didn't change, but his feet did. He widened his stance to anchor, a fighter's habit he hadn't forgotten. Sirens were too far away to save anyone yet, but close enough to choose hesitation. The shop's front window caught the wash of red and blue several blocks down. He weighed the math, decided the problem had grown larger than his paycheck, and backed toward the door like a man exiting a story he could no longer control. "You're making noise you can't manage," he said lightly, almost kindly, and left a paper cup upside down on the counter as if he'd been a customer all along. Agent Park called back 2 minutes later, her voice clean, clipped, in motion. "Stay in public view," she said. "Units are en route. Do not get in any car you did not arrive in." Linda set the bat on the floor and counted Sarah's breaths with her own. The manager locked the side door and pulled down the shade. For a long beat, no one spoke. Then Sarah asked what Linda meant by promise. Linda told her the shape of a truth without forcing the name. How a program turned corridors into exits, how a district taught mercy without oversight, how a storage unit in Washington held boxes labeled like they were meant to be found. Sarah leaned on the counter and touched the inside of her left wrist where a thin white line lived. She traced it as if it might show a map. "I had a scar there when I was little," she said. No one remembered how it happened. Linda nodded as if the tilt of her head could hold both their histories upright. "Memories can be folded," she said, "but they crease in the same places." Boise PD arrived fast because a patrol car had been 3 blocks away at a traffic stop that ended early. Hart's number lit Linda's phone with a text, "Hold your position. My call to Park landed. You did fine," and the relief that followed came with a cost. If this was only a flank, the center would move. Park stepped into the cafe 10 minutes later, flashed ID, and separated the room into statements and calm. She looked at Sarah like law looks at evidence that can also break. "We'll go slow," she said. "You decide what you want to remember." Outside, the river carried light away in long strips. Linda stood by the window and watched the bend where the path disappeared under trees. Her phone buzzed. A blocked number. A single message. 4 words again, but different this time. "You brought the match." The text came like a tap on glass. "You brought the match." It didn't brag. It didn't threaten. It recognized momentum. By dawn, Agent Elena Park had a task force in motion. Search warrants queued, subpoenas drafted for vendors that had seemed too boring to matter. Hale's vocabulary had hidden the bones of a system in plain sight, but the bones kept receipts. A maintenance contractor in Tacoma billed for non-structural wall remediation 5 days after June 3, 1997. A locksmith in Chehalis logged 3 replacement cylinder cores for a basement door no blueprint admitted existed. A temp agency sent evening clerks, who always clocked out before the cameras came back online. Pattern stepped into the light when she pulled the right threads. Cascade on one invoice, a hand-scribbled Riverside, on another, a P.O. box that traveled with the money like a shadow. Linda sat across from Sarah in the Boise precinct's quiet room, the kind with soft chairs as if comfort could discipline memory without force. Sarah kept turning her ring without noticing, then stopping when she did, then doing it again because nerves run on loops. Park spoke gently and asked permission for every step. "Do you want to look at photographs? Do you want to tell me if any voice on these tapes feels familiar? Do you want to choose when to stop?" Sarah chose to listen before speaking. The tape from H. Carver's box played at low volume. The calm male voice shaped choices like a path paved and lit. Then a second tape Park had pulled from K. Duarte's box. Different year, same structure, a consultation disguised as consent. Sarah closed her eyes, and in the turn of her head an old corridor flickered. "There was a smell like paint," she said. "Someone said the door would open if we followed rules. I remember a cart." She pressed her fingers over the scar on her wrist and left them there, grounding the present. The arrest came not with a raid but with paperwork. Park wanted Hale to understand precisely what had failed him. Details. She had him picked up leaving a civic luncheon where he talked about grant compliance and the moral duty of adult education. He turned toward the agents like a man accustomed to shaping rooms by tone and pace. The cuffs read him another grammar. In his office, they found file drawers emptied into bankers' boxes labeled with bland titles, Archive A, Archive B, like a private joke on the evidence he'd curated for years. In a safe were a half-dozen microcassettes, a ledger of placements, and a thumb drive with a folder tree called Pathways. The drive contained outlines for motivational interviews, lists of contacts who facilitated transitions, and, buried 3 subfolders down, a scan of a contract for consulting with an adoption agency dissolved in the early 2000s. It was enough to connect, not enough to conclude alone. That's how systems survive. Every piece looks like an isolated favor. But Linda's brass key had already opened more than a door. Cascade Unit 47 led to 2 other units leased under shell names along 84 and US 12, each a tidy museum of the story the public hadn't been allowed to hear. Taped intakes, letters never mailed, objects small enough to carry and large enough to break a family when rediscovered. Agent Park moved calmly, looped in U.S. attorneys who knew how to build a conspiracy case without snapping it. Sheriff Noel Hart watched as the work he'd promised 15 years earlier finally had air. He apologized to Linda without excuse. She accepted without ceremony. Grief had taught them both that apologies don't refill years, but they can relocate the weight. In court, Hale tried the language he loved. He called it a pipeline to stability. He called desperation a consent form. He called paperwork a cure. The jury learned to hear around the words. They watched the way Park laid invoices beside dates beside door cycles. They listened to the tapes and heard not just questions but choreography, isolate, soften, redirect. They heard Sarah describe a bruise that didn't fit her life in Boise but matched a memory her body still believed. They saw Linda lift a small brass keychain, etched like a river line, and say without any theater that she had been waiting to put it down. The verdict was not triumphant, it was a release. Multiple counts, kidnapping under color of authority, trafficking by fraud, conspiracy to obstruct an investigation, stacked end to end until the law felt as long as the years had been. Hale never looked at the gallery when the sentence landed. He stared at the table as if surface could save him. Afterward, the hallway filled with the subdued chaos of phones, reporters, and family members learning how to stand in a new story. Park stepped back into the quiet with a clipboard still tucked under her arm, the warrant that had learned its own power. Cases like this don't end, she told Linda. They just stop hurting new people. Sarah didn't reclaim a name. She kept Nolan because the life attached to it held a husband who believed her and a job that made sense when nothing else did. She met Linda in small circles. Coffee first, then a drive by the river, then a Sunday dinner where silence meant rest, not distance. Sometimes, a memory arrived like rain on hot pavement. Sudden, specific, gone before you could catch all of it. They learned not to force it. They learned to mark it and move. On a summer evening, Sarah stood in a doorway with the light behind her and turned her ring for no reason at all. Linda watched and the gesture did not break her. It steadied them both. What stayed with me after the trial was simpler than the paperwork. Truth doesn't explode, it accumulates. You stack small, provable things until they outweigh the elegant lie. Institutions bend when ordinary details line up and refuse to move. And the people you think you've lost, if they can't come back whole, can still teach you how to live in the world you have.